During the years that my family and I lived in northern France, we were located about an hour north of a famous battleground from World War I. This battlefield contains today a very impressive monument to the Canadian forces that won an important victory there. The site is called Vimy, or Vimy Ridge. And you can see there, in addition to the monument, you can visit the trenches that have been restored. You also see bomb craters throughout some rather enormous ones, throughout the entire park. But there was one area of the park, or several areas I should say, that you can't visit. They're marked off by barbed wire. They're pastoral settings, you might say. In fact, they are pastoral settings in the sense that they have flocks of sheep grazing on them, but they're all grazing within barbed wire areas. And the reason the barbed wire is there is to keep the sheep in, but also to keep the tourists out, because these areas still contain live landmines from World War I that were never cleared. I'm told that fortunately it's been many years since any of these sheep has actually had a surprise along with their meal. But the sheep are, because they're very agile and they're light, are able to graze fairly safely through those areas and keep the grass cropped down. Well, I feel a little bit like that's what I'm about to lead you into today as we look at lesson 1.20. Now, I'm not comparing you to sheep, but I am warning you that there are going to be a lot of unexpected surprises as you go through lesson 1.20. We're going to divide the lesson into two parts. We're going to first look at the verb conjugations of these new verbs that you've just learned, from abrir to ir, because there are a number. In fact, the exceptions, you might say the irregular forms, are in this case the rule. They're more common than the regular verbs. So you may have noticed in the videos, when the irregular verb comes up, I indicate that it's bizarre, kind of like me. And so you're going to see a lot of bizarre forms of verbs in this particular lesson. So let's take a look at the conjugations. Prepare yourselves for a number of surprises as we look at lesson 1.20. So here you see we're in lesson 1.20, and within this lesson, the first section, of course, contains the instructional video. Make sure you're watching those videos, because they will repeat and reinforce a lot of the things I'm saying in these videos, but of course doing it in Spanish as an additional challenge for you. And hopefully they're comprehensible enough, although they're in Spanish, that you're able to benefit from them. The second section contains a review of the verbs that you've just learned, from abrir to ir. And then we come to, in the third section, an instruction that you are to listen. You're simply to listen, and you're to listen to the conjugations, the forms, the pattern, you might say, of the conjugations of these new verbs you've learned. And as I mentioned, there are going to be a lot of surprises. Now, the surprises exist. The unexpected forms of these conjugations exist in three different types. First of all, you have verbs which are just plain strange, which are just plain bizarre, something like that. You have the verbs which, especially in the first person singular, that means the yo form, will present you with forms you didn't anticipate hearing. And then the second type of unusual verb here is what's called a stem changer. A stem changing verb is one where the vowel sound in the beginning of the verb is going to change once the verb is conjugated. So if you learn, let's take, for example, encontrarse. Well, the actual verb, as I'll explain a little bit later, is just encontrar. Se is something different. We'll talk about that later. But encontrar is the verb. However, when you put it in its conjugated form, we'll say yo as the subject, you say yo me encuentro. So encontrar changed to encuentro. Encontrar, encuentro, encuentras, encuentra. So those are called stem changing verbs. And the third kind, I just referred to indirectly, are reflexive verbs. You already have dealt with a verb in a reflexive form in the first few units. It was lavarse, or lavar, which can be lavarse. Okay, let's begin first as we're treading lightly, carefully through this minefield of linguistic problems, challenges. Let's take a look at the irregular forms, first of all. So I mentioned most of these irregular forms, unexpected forms, will be found in the yo form, whereas the rest of the verb's conjugation will be handled in the normal fashion. So here we have abrir. Fortunately, abrir is one of the two, I believe it is, verbs in this section It is completely normal. Yo abro, tú abres. Él abre, ella abre, usted abre. Okay? However, once we get to the next verb, which is salir, we run to the first surprise, and that's a g sound in the yo form. Yo, it's not yo salo, like you wish it were. It's yo salgo. Now, you've dealt with two other verbs up to this point that do the same thing. They insert the sound g, which is a G, of course, in the verb's conjugation in the first person singular, the yo form. Do you remember what those two verbs were that added a g sound that you didn't expect hearing? Right, one was hacer, yo hago, not yo hago, and the other was decir, which instead of hearing yo diso or deso, it's yo digo, g, yo digo. So hacer, decir, and now salir, and you'll find others here. Also add this g sound in the first person singular. Once you get past the first person singular, the yo form, yo salgo, the rest are handled normally, the conjugations. Tú sales, él sale, ella sale, usted sale. Okay. Quedarse, the verb itself is only quedar. The se, I'm going to talk about last of all. That's that reflexive pronoun that we'll deal with when we talk about reflexive verbs. But in any case, quedar itself is handled in a normal fashion. If I were to cut off the reflexive pronoun, the se, it would just be yo quedo, tú quedas, él queda, ella queda, usted queda. So quedarse is not a problem of this type for the moment. Next verb down is irse, and we're going to put it aside until later on because irse is the same verb as ir, which is the last one in this list, and so it'll be handled in the same fashion. We'll wait until we get to ir to talk about its forms. Next one down is is caminar, and caminar, fortunately, is another regular verb. Camino, caminas, camina, no problem. Oír, again, is a verb which has this g sound in the yo form. You don't say yo oigo like you wish you would. You say yo oigo, yo oigo. The other forms are normal. Oyes, oye. Tú oyes, él oye, ella oye, usted oye. Ver is more or less regular, you could say. It's more or less predictable. We add the o sound at the end. Yo veo, tú ves, él ve, and so that's not a verb deserving particular attention. However, conocer is another of these irregular forms in the yo form. Conocer is yo conozco. It adds the sound k, rather than g, k, like it's a C. Yo conozco in its yo form. The rest of the forms are regular. Tú conoces, él conoce, ella conoce, usted conoce. And so you're getting the idea that it's the yo form primarily, which is going to present us with a problem here. It's only the verb ir that you'll hear in a moment, where all the forms are going to be surprising to you. Here we come to venir, and venir is another of these verbs, which adds the sound g. It's yo vengo in the yo form. Its other forms, however, are unexpected as well to some extent, and they are of the second type. We're going to talk about the stem changing verbs, so I'll postpone that discussion. Here we have encontrarse. Again, it's a stem changing verb, so we'll talk about that in a second. And it's also a reflexive verb, which has the se at the end of it, and we'll talk about that as well later on. Here we have hablar. Hablar is the third verb, which is normal, fortunately. Yo hablo, tú hablas, él habla, very predictable. And last of all, we come to ir, which is totally extraño, totally unexpected, strange, bizarre. We don't say yo, or tú ies, or él ye. We say yo voy, tú vas, él or ella va. Okay? Yo voy, tú vas, él va, ella va, usted va. So the verb changes entirely from I, the sound I, to a V sound. Ir to voy, vas, va. Now this is not entirely unknown to you, you might say, because this same verb, in a form that we'll learn about in the second unit, you've heard, I'm sure, many times. Vamos, vamos, let's go. Well, vamos is a form of this same verb. Voy, vas, va, vamos is the verb ir as well. Okay, so you've had some probable background in exposure to the sound v, va, in this particular verb. You just didn't know what verb it was before this point. Okay, so those are the irregular, unexpected verbs. All right. Now let's go back and look what are called the stem-changing verbs, and I'll have to pick out which ones those are. A stem-changing verb is a verb where the vowel sound, as I mentioned earlier, is going to change when the verb is conjugated. That means when you give it a subject. Okay. Let me see if I can find one right off the bat here. Salir, quedarse, irse, caminar, oír, not quite, ver, conocer, no. Here's the first one, venir, and the other is going to be encontrarse. Venir. The sound you hear when you learned this verb was venir. When you say yo, I just mentioned this is one of the forms that adds the g sound. By the way, are you enjoying this minefield thus far? Few people probably would, but let's continue. Yo vengo is the yo form. However, when you get to the tú, or the él, or the ella, or the usted forms of the verb venir, the e changes to the sound ie. E changes to ie. So it's yo vengo, but tú vienes. In él or ella, viene. Okay, so that's a stem change, a change in the vowel sound in the midst of the first part of the verb. Next one down, encontrarse is the other stem changing verb in this section. Enco, o, you hear the sound o. When you learn this verb, it was encontrarse, and that's the original form of the verb. The form you see in a dictionary, it's called the infinitive, the original form that a verb contains. But once you give it a subject, yo, for example, you say yo me encuentro. The o sound becomes ue. Encuentro. Tú te encuentras. Él se encuentra. Ella se encuentra. Usted se encuentra as well. So the o changes to the sound ue. So these two verbs, venir and encontrarse, are called stem-changing verbs. You'll notice that the vowel sound at the beginning of them, toward the beginning at least, is going to change to a different set of sounds when you get into their conjugated forms with the subject. Third, you are having a good time, are you not? All right. There is hope. Someday there will be. You will see light at the end of this tunnel. How will you see light at the end of the tunnel? It's going to be by doing exactly what the instruction tells you to do. But not just this. It's going to be this and this and this. It's going to be listen to the patterns of the conjugations. Listen to the patterns of the conjugation. Listen to the pattern over and over again until those patterns, and repeat, of course, those patterns become imprinted in your mind. And then after that, to try to make a mistake conjugating these verbs would be almost impossible. It would be too unusual for you. It's like you do the same thing in English. The verb to be. To a foreigner learning English, they have to learn that be changes to am, is, and are in English, in the different forms of that particular verb. And that's hard for a foreigner to learn. Well, it's going to be the same for you. It's a matter of hear these things enough times until eventually the irregular, unusual, unexpected forms become very, very natural. And you really almost couldn't make a mistake if your life depended on it. Okay, last of all, here we go to, this is, the last type is the reflexive verbs. A reflexive verb is any verb that you hear which has the sound se at the end of it. For example, the verbs here are encontrarse, irse, and the third, help me out here, what is it? I got to look for it. Irse, encontrarse, and there's another one here, and it is, I'm still searching for it. Ver, conocer, caminar, irse, encontrarse, salir, abrir, salir, quedarse, irse, caminar, oír, ver, conocer, venir, encontrarse, hablar, ir. Oh, there are only two. Oh, it's quedarse. Quedarse, irse, and encontrarse are the three irregular verbs in this section. And what's this all about? What's this say all about? You've already dealt with, on one occasion, a verb which can be used in a reflexive manner, and that was this verb right here, lavar. We can say, yo lavo el carro. I wash the car. Lavo los trastes, I wash the dishes. But when we do the action to ourselves, we must use the verb not lavar, but lavarse, which indicates we're doing the action to ourselves. And when we do that, we have to add an additional word. It's called a reflexive pronoun before the verb. We don't just say yo lavo, we say yo me lavo. You may remember that as you were doing the exercises early in this unit. Tú, and you don't just say tú lavas, you say tú te lavas when you're doing the action to yourself. And you don't just say él lava, but él se lava, or ella se lava, usted se lava. So these additional pronouns, me, te, and se, are added after the subject and before the verb, in between the two of them. Yo lavo becomes yo me lavo. Tú lavas becomes tú te lavas. Él lava becomes él se lava when the action is done to oneself. That's how you handle a reflexive verb. So you notice, initially you learn lavar se, that se passes before the verb when it has a subject, and then it adapts itself to whatever the particular subject is. If the subject is yo, it becomes me. And you'll always only hear yo me. You'll never hear yo te, not in this context anyway. You'll never hear yo te. You'll never hear yo se. It'll always be yo me. Whenever you're using this kind of a verb which has a se at the end, like encontrarse, quedarse, irse, lavarse, and you give it the subject tú, then that se will pass before the verb and it will adapt to tú. It will not be se any longer, it will be te. So you'll always hear with this kind of verb, tú, te, and then lavas or quedas or whichever the verb is. You'll never hear tú me, you'll never hear tú se. Okay? And then last of all, when the subject is él or ella, you will always hear se before the verb. Él se lava. Él se queda. Él se va. That's the strange one here. And then él se encuentra. Okay, you'll never hear yo, or you'll never hear él me. You'll never hear él te. It'll always be él se. So again, yo me, tú te, él, ella, or usted, se. So that's how a reflexive verb is handled. We have, therefore, let's take a look at one of them. Here we have the verb encontrarse, encontrarse, okay? Encontrarse, when the subject is yo, if I click, I will hear yo me encuentro. Tú, if I click go to the next one and click, I'll hear tú te encuentras. When I say él, it'll be él se encuentra. Él se encuentra. Okay, so that's how a reflexive verb is handled. Any verb which has the sound se at the end, that when the verb is given a subject, that se will pass from the end of the verb before the verb and it will adapt to the subject. Yo me, tú te, él se, ella se, usted se. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed that minefield. You know, when I was a high school student, I had a Swedish exchange student come and live with me, and it was a great experience living with that guy. And he was a very interesting person, very intelligent, a good friend. Always beat me playing golf, which I didn't appreciate. But in any case, my freshman year of college, after my freshman year, he invited me to come to Sweden and spend 3 weeks with his family. And not just with his family, but we also traveled with a friend of his up and down the western coast of Europe. Along the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel. And we were in, I think it was the Netherlands, if I remember correctly, and we would camp wherever we could. We'd just pitch a tent in order to save money instead of staying in a hotel. And so one particular evening, it was getting late, we needed to find a place to settle down for the night, and we saw along the English Channel, in fact, a beach which had some rather tall weeds growing up around it, but it looked like a very beautiful place as the sun was setting over the English Channel. a beautiful place to camp for the night. The only problem was it was marked off by barbed wire. And we thought we could just slip through the wire. We're not going to bother anybody who's going to be there till the morning, and we could camp here. But there was a sign on the fence, and I didn't speak any Dutch. And my friends, my Swedish friends, who spoke excellent English, by the way, they also could speak German. And German was close enough to Dutch that they could figure out that the sign was warning us not to go on the beach because, yes, for the same reason as at Vimy, there were uncleared landmines still on the beach. And fortunately, therefore, my friends had studied their German, had applied themselves to their German, so that as we drove in tent stakes, and we didn't do it, of course, but if we had driven in tent stakes, we would have gotten a massive surprise, and not a good one. And so, in the same way, I know this is tough. Tomorrow we'll look at additional unexpected grammatical elements in the second half of this lesson. But as you listen, as you study with diligence, like my Swedish friends study German, it'll make all the difference in your ability to express yourselves. And eventually, you'll be able to pick your way nimbly through the linguistic landmines of lesson 1.20, just like those sheep at Vimy, without any unexpected surprises. Okay, I'll see you in the course of tomorrow's class, or next day's class, whenever you happen to come back. Adios.